The room smelled of disinfectant and raw wood. It was 1943, and somewhere in the interior of occupied China, inside a building that had once been a textile warehouse, a young woman stood in front of a clerk she had never seen before. He did not look up at her. He held a pen in one hand and a ledger in the other, and the ledger was already open to a page with printed columns: date, origin, age, physical condition, assigned number. She had a name. She had been called by that name for 19 years, in a village in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, by a mother and a grandmother, and the neighbors who had watched her grow. She had a name, and before the hour was finished, the ledger would not contain it. In its place would be a number. In its place would be a Japanese name she had not chosen. The clerk's pen moved, the page filled, and the woman who had been Hana, a composite drawn from the testimonies and legal depositions of survivors recorded decades later, became, in the language of military administration, Unit 14, Station 7. By the time the war ended, ledgers like that one existed in warehouses, military outposts, converted inns, and field offices across East Asia. The entries were neat. The columns were consistent. The handwriting was careful. History was not. For nearly half a century after the war, those ledgers, and the system they documented, were one of the most aggressively buried institutional crimes of the 20th century. This is the story of how a modern military bureaucracy turned the bodies of civilian women into a managed resource, documented the process with administrative precision, and then spent decades insisting the documentation did not exist. If you follow histories that institutions preferred to close, consider subscribing. Now, let us go back to the beginning. In 1939, the world was still in the habit of imagining war as something that happened between armies. There were front lines and rear lines. There were combatants and civilians. There were rules, imperfectly followed, frequently violated, but rules nonetheless, governing what could be done to non-fighting populations. International conventions had been signed. Governments had made commitments. The architecture of international law, however fragile, was publicly maintained. Most people in most countries believed, or chose to believe, that the worst of modern warfare would be contained within that architecture. That belief did not survive the decade. What replaced it was something different, a series of decisions made in offices and meeting rooms by men in uniforms carrying briefcases to treat civilian populations not as persons to be protected, but as materials to be managed. The language changed first, then the procedures, then the structures. And the structures, once built, did not require individual cruelty to function. They required compliance. They required paperwork. They required a clerk with a pen and an open ledger. Korea in the late 1930s was not a country in any administrative sense that the Japanese Empire was prepared to acknowledge. It had been formally annexed in 1910, and by the time the Pacific War intensified, its population of roughly 24 million people existed, in the eyes of Imperial Japan's governing apparatus, as colonial subjects, legally ambiguous, economically exploitable, and demographically available. The peninsula's young men had already been funneled into labor battalions and, increasingly, into military units. Its young women were about to become the subject of a different kind of policy. The Imperial Japanese Army's comfort station system, known in Japanese as Ianjo, had its roots in an earlier period, in attempts by military administrators to manage disease rates among soldiers and reduce incidents of individual assault in occupied territories that were generating diplomatic complaints. The reasoning was clinical. The language in internal military documents, portions of which survived the post-war destruction orders and were later examined by historians and legal scholars, described the system in terms of hygiene, morale, and operational efficiency. Women were not mentioned in those early documents as people. They were mentioned as variables in an equation whose purpose was the maintenance of military functionality. This matters, not because it excuses anything, it does not, but because it explains the mechanism. The comfort station system did not emerge from chaos. It did not emerge from the spontaneous cruelty of individual soldiers acting without oversight. It emerged from a planning process. It was budgeted. It was inspected. It was regulated by written guidelines that specified, among other things, the hours of operation, the pricing structure by military rank, the medical examination schedule, and the required documentation for each woman placed within the system. Historians examining surviving unit records have noted that some stations maintained logs as methodical as supply inventories. In one documented case, a station's intake register recorded physical descriptions alongside the same bureaucratic notations used for military equipment received from a quartermaster. A human being, reduced to a line in a column. A name, replaced by a number. This was not metaphor. This was procedure. Hana, and here we must be precise. She represents the composite of many women whose testimonies were recorded by researchers and legal bodies in South Korea, the Philippines, China, and the Netherlands in the late 20th century, none of whose original names we use here without their explicit public documentation, had been recruited through a mechanism that itself wore the costume of normalcy. In her village, an intermediary had appeared. The intermediary was sometimes a Korean man working in cooperation with Japanese labor recruiters. Sometimes it was a Japanese civilian contractor. Sometimes it was a local official who had been given a quota. The language used, in most of the documented cases, involved work. Factory work in some accounts. Nursing or support roles in others. A wage. A contract. The promise that money would be sent home. The documents sometimes existed. There were actual contracts, pieces of paper with terms printed on them, sometimes signed by fathers or older male relatives who either did not understand what they were signing or understood and had concluded they had no real choice. Researchers studying the legal architecture of the recruitment process have noted that the existence of a contract was later used, by those defending the system in post-war settings, as evidence of voluntary participation. The contract, in this framing, laundered the coercion. It gave the ledger a clean first entry. The journey to the station often took weeks. Trucks, trains, ships. The same logistics network that moved soldiers and supplies moved women across occupied territories. Ship manifests, some of which survived and were examined decades later, listed women under freight categories. Some manifests used the term special personnel. Some used a phrase that translated roughly as recreational equipment. This language was not careless. It was the language of a system that had already decided, at the administrative level, what category of thing these women were. A ledger line for a life. When Hana arrived at the station, she was examined by a military physician. The examination was clinical. Its results were entered into a record. Her assigned number was stamped onto a small wooden tag. The tag was a physical object. Solid, rectangular, bureaucratically legible. She was expected to display it. It served the same administrative function as a room number at a hotel. The detail is almost unbearable in its ordinariness. The stations were not hidden. This is the piece of the history that the post-war period worked hardest to obscure, and it is the piece that the surviving documentation makes most difficult to deny. The comfort station system operated openly within the structure of the Imperial Japanese military. Commanding officers received written guidelines. Military physicians conducted the medical inspections that the guidelines required. Supply chains delivered materials to the stations through the same channels that delivered food and ammunition. Unit diaries, military logs kept by officers as a standard administrative requirement, referenced station access in the same entries that recorded weather conditions and patrol schedules. Some of those unit diaries survived. A portion were captured by Allied forces during the war, before anyone understood what they contained. Others passed into private collections, held by individuals who may or may not have grasped their significance. Still others simply outlasted the destruction orders, filed before the orders arrived, or stored in locations the orders never specified. Historians who have spent careers examining these documents have described the experience in terms that suggest a particular kind of dissonance. The bureaucratic calm of the language against the reality of what the language was describing. In the world outside the station, in occupied territories across East Asia, daily life for civilian women had already been reconfigured around the presence of military power. The occupation had its own rhythms. There were curfews and checkpoints and rules about movement. There were food allocation systems that distributed resources according to categories of person, and the categories were not equal. There were labor conscription policies that could be applied and reapplied and applied again, with each application requiring new documentation, new compliance, new evidence that the person in question had surrendered the relevant portion of their autonomy. Women navigated this terrain with the tools available to them, which were limited. The Japanese sociologist and historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki, whose research published in the 1990s was among the first systematic scholarly examinations of the comfort station system using primary military documents, described the occupied territories as environments in which the formal legal protections that might theoretically have applied to civilian women were structurally inaccessible. There was no authority to appeal to that was not itself part of the occupying structure. The court and the army and the labor contractor and the military physician were not separate institutions. They were the same institution, operating through different windows. You could not complain to the system about the system. Inside the station, time moved differently. This is one of the consistent elements across the testimonies collected from survivors in multiple countries. The way time reorganized itself around a schedule that was not theirs. There were designated hours. There were cues outside the door, visible, audible, ordinary to those maintaining them. There were required songs. At some stations, women were instructed to learn and perform Japanese military songs. Songs of imperial pride, songs of sacrifice, songs written for men going to war. The singing was administrative. It served morale purposes. It was sometimes required before the designated hours began, in the same way that a factory might require workers to assemble before a shift. The silence that followed was a different kind of sound. The medical examinations continued on a regular schedule. The records from those examinations were kept. Women who became ill were sometimes removed from the active roster and placed in a separate administrative category. Some records describe this status as suspended. Some use the term under treatment. Some women simply disappeared from the ledger without notation. The column for their name, their number, simply ended. The next line was the next entry. A line ended. The ledger continued. Requests to leave the station, documented in testimonies and referenced obliquely in surviving administrative correspondence, were processed through a formal procedure that involved the repayment of the recruitment debt. The debt had accumulated from the transport, the food, the housing, the materials provided since arrival. The structure of the debt, as described in available records and examined by legal historians in the context of post-war compensation cases, was one in which repayment was arithmetically possible but practically unreachable. The daily earnings credited to a woman's account were offset by the daily charges assessed against it. The arithmetic did not resolve. This was not an accident. Debt bondage as a mechanism of control has a long administrative history. Its application here was deliberate, documented, and defended in post-war legal settings by representatives of the system as evidence that the women were technically independent economic participants. A contract, a debt, a number on a wooden tag. The bureaucracy was thorough. Here is the moment in this story where the shape of the thing becomes fully visible. It requires a pause. The comfort station system was not a collection of individual crimes committed by individual soldiers in the chaos of war. It was a policy. It had a chain of command. It had an inspection regime. It had a medical protocol. It had an accounting system. It had official correspondence flowing between station managers, unit commanders, and military administrative offices. The women inside it were not invisible to the machinery of the Imperial Japanese state. They were, in the precise sense, processed by it. When this becomes clear, when the viewer holds both facts simultaneously, the suffering and the spreadsheet, something shifts. This is not the shock of discovering that people were cruel. People are often cruel in war. This is the shock of discovering that the cruelty was filed, that it was reviewed, that it was, in the language of the time, managed. When a military physician signed an inspection form, he was not committing a spontaneous act. He was completing a document. When a commanding officer included station access schedules in his unit diary, he was following administrative procedure. When the intermediary in Hana's village presented a contract to her father, he was operating within a recruitment framework that had been designed by someone in an office who had written guidelines that had been approved by someone further up a chain of command. No single person in that chain needed to believe they were doing something monstrous. Each person needed only to do their part of the process. The process did the rest. This is the mechanism. This is what makes it difficult to look at directly, and more important to look at than the alternative. The war ended in August 1945. The silence that followed was, in its own way, as structured as what had come before. The destruction orders came quickly. Documents were burned in significant quantities in the days and weeks following the Japanese surrender. The scale of what was destroyed is, by definition, difficult to measure, but surviving correspondence between military administrators in the final weeks of the war makes clear that document destruction was treated as a priority in the same administrative language as other military priorities. Orders were issued. Compliance was expected. Unit diaries were fed into fires. Station intake ledgers went with them. In some locations, the burning took place in open courtyards, witnessed by soldiers who understood what they were watching and said nothing. Not everything burned. Documents survived in private possession, passed quietly from hand to hand, stored in places the destruction orders never reached. Allied forces captured materials they did not yet have the context to understand. Archives that would remain unexamined for decades held folders with official stamps and careful handwriting, tucked behind unrelated correspondence, forgotten by everyone except the paper itself. History is often preserved by failure. The women who survived the stations and returned to their home countries faced a different kind of erasure. In post-war Korea, the experience of having been inside the comfort station system carried a social weight that cannot be fully described in clinical terms. The testimonies collected by researchers in the 1980s and 1990s, decades after the end of the war, came from women who, in many cases, had never spoken about their experience to their own families. Some had constructed entirely separate identities. Some had moved to different regions. Some had lived for 40 years in communities that did not know who they were or where they had been. The silence was not chosen freely. It was the only available response to a social environment in which speaking would have cost more than silence already had. The singing stopped. The silence did not. In Japan, the post-war period produced its own administrative response to the comfort station system. The response, for decades, was structured around the word private. Private contractors, private arrangements, individual cases, not policy. Military historians in Japan who attempted to examine the system using primary documents in the 1970s and 1980s described encountering bureaucratic obstruction, documents classified, access denied, archives that contained obvious gaps in their chronological coverage. The gaps were not accidental. Gaps that size require maintenance. In 1991, Yoshimi was working in the library of Japan's self-defense agency. Not the most obvious place to find evidence of a war crime, which may be precisely why it was still there. The documents he located had not been destroyed. They had simply been shelved in the wrong section, adjacent to unrelated administrative correspondence, overlooked for nearly 5 decades. They bore official military stamps. They referenced the comfort station system by name in the institutional language of command-level planning. When Yoshimi's findings were published in 1992, they did not describe something that had been suspected. They confirmed something that the official record had been constructed, for 50 years, to deny. The Japanese government acknowledged, that same year, that the military had been involved. The language of the acknowledgement was precise in the way that carefully constructed official language is always precise, acknowledging involvement, stopping short of certain legal conclusions, leaving space for the continuation of the debate that continues to the present day. It was, in its own way, another administrative document. Careful handwriting, clean columns, controlled conclusions. The surviving women, by then in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, had been waiting, in most cases, for half a century. The ledgers that survived are held in archives in multiple countries. Some are in South Korea, some are in Japan. Some are in the United States, in collections assembled by Allied intelligence during and after the war. Researchers who have examined them describe the experience of reading them in terms that are worth holding for a moment. The handwriting is neat. The columns are clean. The entries are consistent. There is nothing in the physical appearance of the documents that marks them as different from any other administrative record of the period. That is precisely what they are, administrative records. That is what makes them significant, not their exceptional quality but their ordinariness. Among the physical objects that survived alongside the documentary record are the wooden tags. Several have been preserved. They are small, the size of a hotel key fob roughly. They are numbered. They are unremarkable as physical objects. In a different context, they would not attract attention. In this context, each one represents the moment in which a person's name was removed from the official account of their own existence and replaced with something the system could more efficiently process. Some of the women gave testimony before they died. The testimonies are part of the official record of the Asian Women's Fund, established in 1995, and of subsequent governmental and non-governmental documentation processes. In those testimonies, survivors describe the moment of being assigned a number, a Japanese name, a tag. They describe it with a specificity that suggests it stayed with them, that among all the things that could be described, the moment of renaming was one that did not fade. A number for a name, a line in a ledger for a life. Hana's story did not end with the Pacific. It did not end with the particular administrative system that had processed her. What the Second World War revealed, across every theater in which it was fought, was that the targeting of civilian women was not a regional aberration or a cultural peculiarity. It was a convergent solution, arrived at independently, by different militaries, under different flags, through different bureaucratic structures, toward the same functional end. In occupied Europe, German forces operating under a different administrative architecture employed different mechanisms. In Soviet-occupied territories, mass violence against civilian women was documented in post-war tribunal proceedings and in the letters of soldiers, letters intercepted, censored, and in some cases preserved by military intelligence. In the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Burma, in the Netherlands East Indies, in each territory, the record left a version of the same pattern: administration preceding violence, documentation accompanying it, and erasure following it. The erasure was never complete. It is never complete. The wall of a converted warehouse in a city in central China, examined during renovations in 2003, was found to contain scratched markings at approximately shoulder height. Symbols, some researchers have suggested, consistent with characters from the Korean writing system, Hangul. The markings could not be definitively dated. They could not be definitively attributed. Historians and archaeologists examining the site described the markings as consistent with the period and the population that the documentary record placed in that location. They could not say more than that. The scratches in the wall, the misfiled document, the wooden tag in an archive box, the testimony given 40 years later in a voice that had kept the silence for so long it had almost become permanent. These are what remains when the institution that created the record decides the record should not exist. They are not nothing. The women who testified publicly in South Korea beginning in 1991, beginning with Kim Hak-soon, whose name she gave freely, and whose act of public testimony broke a silence that had lasted nearly half a century, did so knowing what it would cost. The social response in some cases was exactly what the silence had been protecting against. That they spoke anyway is part of the record. It is worth noting that the institution that had processed them in ledgers did not give them the language to describe what had happened. They had to find the language themselves, against the resistance of a culture that had organized itself, in the post-war period, around not having to hear it. Kim Hak-soon died in 1997. The legal cases she helped initiate were not resolved in her lifetime. Many of the women who came forward after her died before any form of official legal acknowledgement was completed. Some are still living. The youngest survivors of the wartime system are now in their 90s. The ledgers are still in the archives. What the history of the comfort station system reveals, and what the broader history of civilian targeting in the Second World War reinforces, is not that war produces cruelty. That has always been known. What it reveals is the specific efficiency with which modern administrative systems can organize cruelty into a procedure indistinguishable in its paperwork from any other procedure. The intake form and the inspection schedule and the debt ledger did not make the system more humane. They made it more durable. They made it harder to stop from the inside. They gave it a structure that could outlast the individuals within it, because no single individual needed to hold the whole of it in mind. The clerk did not need to understand what he was part of. He needed only to fill in the columns. This is what the post-war silence protected. Not the memory of individual cruelty. Individual cruelty in war has always been acknowledged, but the memory of institutional design. The memory that this was not an accident. The memory that it was planned, funded, inspected, and recorded by people who went home afterward and described themselves, and were described by others as having served their country. The wooden tags are still in the archive boxes. The scratches are still in the wall. The columns in the ledgers are still neat, and the handwriting is still careful, and the names that were replaced by numbers are still missing from the places where names should be. The question that remains is not really about the past. It is about what we believe institutions are capable of, and about how quickly we are prepared to accept that a procedure, because it is a procedure, must therefore be something other than what it is. The clerk filled in the column. The column was part of a form. The form was part of a system. The system had a name and a budget and an inspection schedule and a chain of command that extended upward until it reached the people who had decided it was necessary. We have always known how to make systems. The question is what we decide they are for.